Why do we create gathers? We create gathers on a garment where we want to shrink or bring the garment to a certain width. So we started by adding volume to the piece of to a piece or a section of our garment, and then we want to bring it down to fit into a specific width. So that's one of the reasons why we would use gathers. For example, if you look at this piece of fabric here, or this sample piece here, you would see that I had to gather all of this in order for it to fit into this the width of this top piece of fabric. So I'm going to be showing you on this piece. This is the shorter piece of fabric, and this is the longer piece of fabric. So I'm going to gather this long piece of fabric in order for it to sit nicely into this short piece of fabric. Now, there are a few things that you need to know when you're creating gathers. The first thing you need to know is the seam allowance. So if you look here on this line, I left from the edge of the fabric to this line 1.5 centimeters, and from the edge of this fabric to this line as well, I have 1.5 centimeters. Now, in order to create my gathers, I'm going to be using a basting stitch. And if you look at the two first lines that I marked with my pencil, that is where I am going to be making my basting stitch. So the basting stitch is just a temporal stitch that I'm going to use, and I can take it out later on in order to create the gather. So I put that stitch here, pull it, and connect my two pieces of fabric. So where you see these blue lines with my seam allowances, I will connect them together, and once I connect them, I will be able to have something similar to this sample piece. So rule number one is just make sure you mark in your seam allowances, and then from the edge of your fabric, it's 0.5 to the first line and 0.5 of a centimeter to the second line, and that is where I will be creating my basting stitch then for my gathers. So that's the first thing you need to know. The next thing then is to go onto your sewing machine and actually set your machine in such a way that it's going to be able to create the basting stitch for you. Some machines would come with the basting stitch already on them, but others don't. If your sewing machine doesn't have a basting stitch, what I'd advise is use the longest stitch length that you have on your machine. So I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and show you on my machine what the basting stitch looks like, and it's the stitch that I'm going to be using for creating my gathers. So this is my sewing machine, and as you can see on the sewing machine, you have different stitches and stitch lengths. So when I'm making my gathers, I normally sew on 4, which is here, but when I'm making my gathers, I would move it to 6, because as you can see, the stitch length is longer than the one on 4. This would help me pull through the stitch very easily once I've sewn in the 2 lines. So in order for me to go to 6, I just need to turn my sewing machine and place it on 6, and I should be good to go then to sew in my basting stitch. Now, as I said before, if you don't have a basting stitch on your machine, what you can do is sew with the longest stitch length that your sewing machine comes with. Okay, so I'm just going to go in then and show you how to actually sew in the 2 lines and how to pull your thread in order to obtain your gathers. So just stay tuned. So this is the fabric with the longer width, and as I said before, I have the 2 lines with, I don't know if you can see there, the 2 lines that are marked with the pencil. Those are the lines that I'm going to be sewing on. And I've set my machine to my basting stitch, which is the longest stitch on my sewing machine. So once you have all those done, the next thing is at the beginning of your sewing, leave a tail of thread because it's going to help you to pull the gathers, and don't backstitch. So it's the forward and backwards movement that you do at the beginning when you're sewing in a permanent stitch. You do that so that your stitch doesn't unravel on you. But when you're doing a basting stitch, you don't do that forwards and backwards movement, because you're going to, it's a temporary stitch. You're going to be taking it out at some stage. If for any reason you have to stop when you're sewing, just make sure your needle stays into your fabric, just so that it doesn't move, because sometimes if it moves, it creates like a zigzag, or it sews on the wrong place, and then when you're pulling, it will be difficult then to pull. So just always make sure your needle stays in your fabric. Said you don't backstitch, and at the end you leave a tail of thread as well. So that's the first line done. I'm going to go ahead and do the second line. So I said you leave your needle in, and then you can arrange your fabric. Make sure the line is as straight as possible so that it doesn't give you problems when you're trying to pull. Okay, so there you go. Now I have my 2 stitches in. I'm going to push my machine to the side and just show you what you need to do in order to have the gathers in. So right now I sewed with a contrasting thread so that you can see, I hope you can see, it's not really a contrasting thread that much, but I hope you can see I have my 2 lines in. What I'm going to do is, just bear with me, I grab a pin. I'm going to be separating the top thread from the bottom thread. So like this. That is my top thread. I'm separating it from the bottom thread, and you can actually pull from top or from the bottom, but I think pulling from the bottom makes it easier for the thread for you to pull. So I'm going to be going with the bottom, but either way works. So I'm taking my bottom thread. I like to roll it on my finger just to give me some support, and I'm pushing in and trying to push and push and push. So I'll just make my top thread stay out of the way. So pull and push, and you push and you push. So this is the movement that creates your gathers for you. And as you see, the more I pull, the more the tail of my thread becomes longer. So I'm just getting my support again, pulling and pushing. And what I want to say here is, if you're working with a really long width of fabric, what you can do is pull from one side. When you're halfway done, I'm going to do it here just to show you. When you're halfway done, you can stop and then start from the other side. So this one is done, okay? And if it's a long piece of fabric, you can just push it in to lock it in, or you can tie the thread. What I advise is, don't tie, if you're tying the thread, don't tie too close to the edge of your fabric, because then you might need to release some of the gathers in order for it to sit nicely on the length. and that might be a problem. So if you're tying, tie a little bit far away, or if you don't want to tie, just push it in nicely like that and it locks it in for you. I'm going to go to the other side, and this is the top, this is the bottom. So I'm going to separate them again like I did with the first one, like that. I hope you can see this now, like that. So I have my bottom piece and I have my top piece. They are separated, and what I'm going to do is pull with my bottom because it's my bottom piece because it's easier, but you can pull with the top piece as well. So we do the same movement to have our gathers. Pull, pull, push. Make sure your stitch length is the longest if you don't have the basting stitch on your machine. This helps the movement to be easier. If I sew with the short, like on my machine as I showed you, number 4, it will be so difficult and I would have probably threads breaking in on me. So it's better to have the longest stitch length on your machine, or make sure to use your basting stitch. Okay, so now I have my gathers in. What I need to do then is make sure it's the same width. Remember, we are gathering in order for it to sit nicely on this shorter piece of my fabric. So what I want to do is make sure it's the same width so that it's going to sit nicely. So if you see here, I've gathered too much, and that's why I said if you're threading, if you are tying your threads, make sure you tie a little bit further, because then you have room to open your gathers when you want to, or if you need to. In this case, like in my case, I did too much, so I need to spread this out. And sometimes you can measure as you go, but normally for me, I just do the gathers and then I spread them evenly to sit nicely on the piece. And make sure you try to get them evenly spread as much as you can, because if not, for example, I have too much gathers here and nothing here, it looks awkward once you finish your garment. So always make sure you are spreading it evenly as much as you can, so that at the end of it you have beautiful evenly spread gathers like you can see on this sample piece. So I'm just going to spread this out. So I'm just measuring it in. Yeah, and I'm happy with that. So the reason I marked this with blue is so that you can see what like have a good view of what I'm going to do next. So let's pretend for a minute that this was the bottom piece of a garment and this was the top piece of my garment, and I need to attach both. Now I need to respect my 1.5 centimeters that I initially had. So I'm going to match this line to this line, pin it together and sew. And in order to do that, I'm going to flip it over, just making sure that this side of my fabric is facing the other side. So this is the wrong side of your fabric and this is the wrong side. So you want to be matching the right sides facing the right sides, and then pinning everything together and sewing. So I'm just going to go ahead and pin it down before I sew. Matching the edge of my fabric, I'm going in and making sure that I'm respecting the seam allowance, pinning it down, and doing the same here and pinning it down. Making sure that my gathers are evenly spread. I'm going to pin this side down as well. I always like to pin the two ends when I'm working make sure they're sitting nicely, and then I can pin the rest. So it depends on you. You can start from left to right, right to left, or pin both sides and then connect the rest. So it just depends on your preference. So this is the way I prefer to do it, and I'm going to pin everything through. So I'm pinning and making sure that I'm respecting my seam allowance. Okay, so that's everything pinned in nicely. Okay, so I'm just making sure everything is sitting in nicely pinned. This is what it looks like. If I put another pin here just to show you. So on the opposite side, this is what it looks like. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and sew. I normally love to sew from the side where I have my gathers. The reason being, as I'm sewing, I'm placing my gathers nice and flat. So as I'm sewing, I'm arranging my gathers to sit nice and flat, arranging them sit nice and flat, and then I sew on the allowance that the 1.5 seam allowance. If you sew on this side, you might gather in more of the fabric and it won't sit nicely on the front. So my advice is, when you're sewing, sew on the side of where you have your gathers and arrange your gathers, make them to stay flat, and then you sew. So I'm going to go to my sewing machine and do that last piece. To my sewing machine, as I said, I'll be sewing where I have my gathers. I just realized that I pinned on the side where I have no gathers, so I'm going to transfer my pins to this side, because then as I sew, I'm going to be taking out the pins. I'm not going to do a temporal stitch. You can also do a temporal stitch by hand and then take out your pins, but I'm just going to sew with the pins. So I'll transfer them to this side and then I'm going to sew. Okay, so that's it done. I'm just going to go then to my machine, place it down. Okay, so another thing I almost forgot to mention is, remember, for the 2 lines you were sewing with your basting stitch. Now you need to bring your machine back to your normal straight stitch in order for you to sew, because at the moment you're sewing a permanent stitch. If you were to sew with the basting stitch, it's not going to be really firm. So always go back to your straight stitch in order to finish up your project. So I'm just going to turn my machine. I hope you can see I'll just stand up briefly. I was on 6, now I'm going back to 4 in order to sew in my straight stitch. So do the same on your sewing machine, and then you can sew in your straight stitch. Another thing is, make sure you are back stitching then, because it's a permanent stitch. Do the backwards and forwards movement at the start. You're not leaving any tails, so at the end you're going to cut off the tails. So do backwards forward stitch, and because it's a permanent stitch. So I'm going to start by doing my back stitch here, and then so I'm placing it where I have my sewing allowance or seam allowance, and then I start with forwards, backwards, and forwards. So that's my back stitch done. and I can keep sewing while arranging. As I said, arrange your gathers so that they sit nicely once you're done sewing your project. And remember to leave your needle in whenever you're trying to arrange your gathers. So you take your time on this one. There's no rush. It's better you take your time and do it once than rushing and having to undo it and sew it a second time. And try as much as possible to respect, I know there are gathers in, so but try as much as possible to respect the seam allowance that you have on your garment. You see, I'm stopping, arranging my fabric, and then moving on. That's what you should be doing as well. And I'm doing a back stitch at the end, and I'm taking out my tail. I'm cutting them on this one. Okay, so I don't know if you can see, I'm just going to bring the thing a little bit closer so you can see everything done. You can see it's sewn in. I try to spread them as evenly as possible, and you can see I also did as much to sew on my seam allowance. So that's your gathers done in. All you need to do then is just press your fabric, and yeah, and that's your gathers done. So that's how you make gathers on a fabric. You can attach them on a sleeve, you can attach them on the waistline, you can use them to make tiers on a garment. So depending on what you want to do, that's the way you do gathers on your piece of fabric. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this helps you create gathers on your piece of fabric or on your garment. And if this video was helpful, please don't forget to give me a thumbs up or a like and subscribe.